Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. How does a country, freshly liberated from the Nazis, plunge almost instantly into a war against itself? This is the story of Greece in 1944, a nation that won the war, only to lose the peace. The German occupation of Greece from 1941 to 1944 left the country broken in body and spirit. Towns were burned, villages massacred, and cities starved. In Athens, the famine of 1941-42 killed over 100,000 people. Mothers buried children in shallow graves. Men wasted away in breadlines. Entire communities disappeared. Liberation, when it came, promised relief. But first, the Greeks had to decide who they were. But Greece was not united. The official government had fled into exile in Cairo, clinging to legitimacy but cut off from its people. At home, a Nazi puppet regime ruled in Athens, despised by all. In this vacuum, resistance movements sprang up, not one, but many. The most powerful was EAM-ELAS, the communist-led National Liberation Front and its armed wing. They promised discipline, equality, and a future where Greece belonged to its workers and peasants. To villagers desperate for order, they seemed the only hope. By 1943, ELAS controlled large swathes of the countryside, creating a state within a state. Courts, schools, even taxes, all run by partisans. But they were not alone. Smaller groups formed too: monarchists, republicans, nationalists. All resisted the Axis, but each dreamed of a different Greece. Old rivalries between left and right, city and village, monarchy and republic, were reignited in the fire of occupation. By 1944, Greeks weren't just fighting Germans. They were fighting each other for the future of their nation. Britain watched closely. For Winston Churchill, Greece was more than another battlefield. It was a prize. He feared communist expansion in the Balkans and saw Greece as a line in the sand. If Athens fell to the left, the entire eastern Mediterranean might follow. To him, keeping Greece in the western camp was worth almost any price. So even as Britain helped arm the partisans, it chose sides. London placed its weight behind the monarchy, even though King George II was widely despised in Greece. Churchill believed the king symbolized continuity, a shield against chaos. To many Greeks, however, this looked less like liberation and more like foreign meddling. Inside Greece, mistrust spread like wildfire. ELAS fought bravely against the Germans, but also clashed with rival resistance groups, assassinating leaders who stood in their way. Nationalist militias accused the communists of plotting a one-party state. The puppet government's security battalions joined the fray, adding another layer of violence. Every village became a chessboard, every family forced to choose a side. By the summer of 1944, as the Germans prepared to retreat, the question was no longer if Greece would be free, but who would control it. Would it be the communists, hardened by years in the mountains? The exiled government in Cairo, returning with British backing? Or some fragile coalition in between? The answer would not come through ballots or slogans. It would come through bullets, betrayals, and blood. Liberation would not heal Greece. It would ignite its civil war. Liberation was still a dream in 1942, but in the mountains of Greece, a new force was already reshaping the nation's future. It was the National Liberation Front, EM, and its armed wing, ELAS. To the starving, desperate villages of occupied Greece, they appeared not just as resistance fighters, but as a vision of an entirely new society. EM was born in September 1941, spearheaded by the Greek Communist Party. Its leaders were not polished politicians, but hardened revolutionaries who had survived prison, exile, and persecution long before the war. Under their guidance, ELAS, the armed branch, emerged a few months later. By spring 1942, guerrilla bands were striking German patrols, sabotaging railways, and ambushing convoys. What set ELAS apart was not just its firepower, but its organization. Unlike the smaller nationalist groups, ELAS demanded strict discipline. Fighters swore loyalty not only to the cause of liberation, but to the promise of a future workers' state. For peasants long suspicious of central authority, this was new and unsettling. Yet ELAS delivered results: protection from German raids, food redistribution, and the sense that someone finally was in control. In the villages, EAM set up schools, issued newspapers, and even organized elections for local councils. To many Greeks, this was their first taste of participation in politics. Women, who had long been excluded from public life, suddenly found themselves teaching, organizing, and even fighting. This was liberation not just from the Germans, but from centuries of hierarchy. But EAM's rise brought conflict. Other resistance groups like Edes in Epirus favored a republican Greece without communism. The royalist Eka leaned toward restoring the monarchy. Both received support from the British, who mistrusted communist ambitions. Clashes between groups became increasingly common, sometimes deadlier than the battles against the Germans themselves. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, operating in the shadows, tried to unite the resistance under one command. But unity was an illusion. Each group knew the war's end was approaching, and each jockeyed for dominance. Behind every ambush or act of sabotage lurked a deeper question. Who would rule Greece after the Nazis? ELAS was confident in its answer. By late 1943, it had grown into an army of more than 50,000 fighters, controlling much of the countryside. In liberated zones, they ran courts, issued ration cards, and executed collaborators. To their supporters, they were heroes. To their rivals, they were a state within a state, a red shadow government rising in the mountains. This dual identity, freedom fighters and political revolutionaries, made ELAS both admired and feared. When they executed rival partisans or accused villagers of treachery, their enemies saw proof of tyranny. When they distributed grain or protected a town from German reprisal, their supporters saw proof of salvation. The Germans understood the danger. Brutal reprisals followed every attack. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, their men executed, their women and children left homeless. Yet even this terror often backfired, driving more Greeks into the arms of ELAS. By 1944, the Nazis controlled the cities and main roads, but the mountains belonged to the communists. For Britain, this was alarming. Churchill wanted a Greece aligned with the West, but the facts on the ground told another story. When the Germans left, ELAS would be the strongest armed force in the country. To many British officers, it was already too late to stop them. But Churchill believed otherwise. He would gamble everything to ensure Greece did not fall to communism, and that gamble would soon ignite Athens itself. By 1943, Greece was both a battlefield and a chessboard. On the surface, the Germans still held the cities, ports, and key transport routes. But in the mountains, rival resistance groups, monarchists, republicans, communists, fought not just the occupiers, but each other. To Winston Churchill, this chaos was more than a sideshow. It was a test of Britain's fading empire. Britain's presence in Greece had begun tentatively. A handful of SOE officers slipped into the mountains carrying radios and gold sovereigns. Their mission was sabotage, blow up rail lines, cut communications, disrupt German supply routes. But soon, they realized sabotage was the easy part. The harder task was managing the Greeks themselves. EAM-ELAS, with its strict discipline and sheer size, overshadowed all other groups. British officers admired their effectiveness but distrusted their politics. Reports back to London were filled with the same refrain. Yes, they fight the Germans, but they are preparing for something more. Churchill needed an alternative. He placed his hopes in the exiled Greek government in Cairo, still clinging to the monarchy. The problem was that King George II was deeply unpopular. To many Greeks, he was a relic of dictatorship, a monarch who had abandoned them during the invasion. Even among his supposed supporters, enthusiasm was thin. Yet Churchill insisted the king must return. Why? Geography and strategy. Britain needed Greece not only as a symbol, but as a foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean. Control of Greece meant influence over the Aegean, the Balkans, and access to the oil-rich Middle East. Churchill feared that if communists took Athens, Moscow's shadow would fall across the sea lanes to Egypt. To him, this was not simply about Greece, it was about empire and survival. So Britain doubled down. Weapons were shipped to resistance groups that opposed ELAS. Gold was funneled into exile politicians who promised loyalty. Propaganda painted the communists as extremists, dangerous to Greece's future. And behind the scenes, British officers tried, often in vain, to broker ceasefires among the warring Greek factions. But the contradictions were glaring. On one hand, British SOE men relied on ELAS to sabotage German lines and provide intelligence. On the other, London plotted to weaken them, fearing their dominance. To the Greeks, this duplicity was obvious. Why should they trust a foreign power that armed their enemies one day and asked for cooperation the next? The exiled government in Cairo hardly helped matters. Far from their homeland, ministers bickered, plotted, and begged the British for support. To many Greeks still suffering under occupation, these exiles seemed irrelevant. Men in suits sipping coffee in Cairo, while villages in Thessaly and Epirus burned. One British officer quipped that they looked like shadows, loud in the desert, while real power was being built in the mountains. By 1944, Churchill's gamble took on sharper edges. The Germans were retreating, and liberation was imminent. Britain had to act fast. If Athens fell into communist hands, no amount of gold or propaganda would bring it back. Operation Mono was drawn up, a plan for British troops to land in Greece as soon as the Germans left, securing key cities and restoring order under the monarchy. It was a bold move, and a dangerous one. The British were preparing not to fight Germans, but potentially their own allies. Soldiers who had fought alongside Greek partisans in North Africa and the islands might now be asked to turn their guns on them. Few in London relished the prospect. Churchill did. For him, ideology and empire outweighed sentiment. The gamble was set. Britain would liberate Greece on its own terms, whether the Greeks liked it or not. And in doing so, it would light the fuse of a new war, one not against Nazis, but against former comrades. By 1944, Greece was a country at war with itself as much as with the Germans. The occupation had created not just hardship, but rival governments, rival armies, and rival dreams. Liberation was coming, but for which Greece? At the heart of the struggle was the uneasy relationship between EAM-ELAS and the smaller British-backed groups. ELAS controlled the mountains, the villages, and the majority of fighters. They saw themselves as the vanguard of a new Greece, Republican, socialist, even revolutionary. Their rivals, Edes in Epirus and Eka in central Greece, had smaller numbers but powerful friends in London. Clashes between them escalated. At first they were skirmishes over territory, a raid on a weapons cache, an ambush blamed on the other. But soon, these incidents became outright battles. In Epirus, Elas and Edes fought bloody engagements, each side accusing the other of betrayal. Villages were caught in the crossfire, forced to declare allegiance or face reprisals. To many ordinary Greeks, it seemed liberation had already become civil war. The British tried to mediate. SOE officers convened meetings in remote mountain huts, urging the factions to cooperate. They brokered truces like the Plaka Agreement in February 1944, meant to unite the resistance under one command. But every truce was fragile, every handshake concealing mistrust. Elas demanded recognition as the core of a new national army. Edes and Eka refused, fearing communist domination. In exile, the government in Cairo was no better. Prime Minister Georgios Papandreou preached national unity, but his cabinet was divided between monarchists and republicans. King George II refused to compromise, insisting he would return as monarch without conditions. Even among exiles, the quarrel over Greece's future monarchy poisoned every discussion. Meanwhile, the Germans exploited these divisions. Their occupation forces armed and trained the dreaded security battalions, collaborationist militias tasked with hunting partisans. To the Germans, they were auxiliaries. To Britain, they were traitors. To Elas, they were mortal enemies. In the Peloponnese, Elas carried out brutal purges, executing hundreds of alleged collaborators, real or imagined. This spiral of violence eroded the line between liberation and revenge. Villages once filled with hope turned into killing grounds. A man might be executed as a collaborator one week, and his neighbor killed as a communist sympathizer the next. For ordinary people, survival meant silence. And yet, the dream of unity flickered briefly. In May 1944, representatives of all major resistance groups, along with the government in exile, met in Lebanon. The so-called Lebanon Charter promised a coalition government, democratic elections, and a referendum on the monarchy. For a moment, it seemed Greece might find common ground, but the ink was hardly dry before suspicions returned. ELAS accused monarchists of conspiring with collaborators. Monarchists accused ELAS of preparing a coup. The British pressed all sides to stay committed, but even they knew the fragile unity would not last. As the Germans prepared to withdraw in late 1944, the fractures deepened. ELAS stood stronger than ever, with tens of thousands of fighters and popular support in the countryside. But Britain was determined that Athens would not fall into their hands. The stage was set. Liberation was coming, but it would not bring peace. It would bring the final confrontation between visions of Greece that could not coexist. In the autumn of 1944, the German grip on Greece finally loosened. The Wehrmacht, battered by defeats on all fronts, prepared to retreat northward into the Balkans. For ordinary Greeks, it should have been a moment of celebration. Instead, it became a moment of foreboding. Everyone knew the occupiers were leaving. What no one knew was who would take their place. The strongest force in the country was EAM-ELAS. Their fighters controlled most of the countryside, and in some regions they acted as the only functioning government. Schools, courts, even local elections bore their stamp. To villagers, they were both protectors and rulers. To Britain and the exiled government in Cairo, they looked more like a state within a state, one that might refuse to step aside once liberation came. Churchill was determined not to let that happen. As early as summer 1944, he approved Operation Mana, the British plan for the occupation of Greece the moment the Germans withdrew. The operation was not about defeating the Axis. They were already leaving. It was about ensuring Athens and the machinery of government fell firmly into Britain's hands. The plan was bold. British paratroopers and armored brigades would land in Greece, secure the capital, and restore authority to the returning government in exile. On paper, they were liberators. In practice, they were also referees, stepping into a fractured country where former allies eyed each other as enemies. On October 12, 1944, German troops evacuated Athens. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags, chanting freedom songs, and embracing in relief. Only hours later, British troops arrived, greeted at first as heroes. Prime Minister Georgios Papandreou returned to the capital on October 18th, standing on balconies to cheering crowds. It looked like a new dawn, but beneath the surface, tension seethed. ELAS still held much of the countryside, and even in Athens their militias were visible. They had fought and bled for liberation, and many of their fighters expected to lead the new Greece. Instead, they were asked to disarm and defer to a government they distrusted, a government carried home in British ships. Papandreou tried to strike a balance. He spoke of unity, promising elections, and a referendum on the monarchy. He even invited communists into his cabinet, a gesture meant to calm fears of exclusion. But the contradictions were glaring. The monarchy still loomed, Britain clearly favored the right, and ELAS refused to dissolve its army. The economic situation made everything worse. Greece was in ruins, railways smashed, factories stripped, fields abandoned. Inflation spiraled out of control. Food was scarce. In Athens, workers staged strikes, demanding relief. ELAS capitalized on the discontent, while Papandreou struggled to hold the government together. The British role became increasingly obvious. Tanks patrolled Athens' streets. British officers advised Greek ministers. To many Greeks, it felt less like liberation and more like foreign occupation in new clothing. By November, disputes turned to open confrontation. Papandreou ordered the disarmament of all partisan forces. ELAS refused. Negotiations dragged on, but mistrust poisoned every word. The communists believed the government and the British were plotting to strip them of power. The government believed ELAS was preparing for a coup. Both were right in their own way. The moment of liberation had passed quickly. Greece was free of the swastika, but its future was already being decided by bayonets, speeches, and secret meetings. The next spark would turn that uneasy peace into open war. The autumn of 1944 should have been Greece's great turning point. The swastika no longer flew over Athens. Crowds filled the streets with flags and songs, and for a fleeting moment, hope seemed possible. Yet beneath the parades and speeches, the country stood on a knife's edge. Liberation did not erase divisions, it sharpened them. When Georgios Papandreou returned from exile, he positioned himself as the man of unity. His speeches promised reconciliation, elections, and a referendum on the monarchy. He invited representatives of EAM-ELAS into his government, hoping to show the world, and his own people, that Greece was not about to collapse into civil war. But appearances deceived. In practice, the coalition was brittle. Papandreou, heavily reliant on Churchill's support, leaned toward the monarchy and the right. The communists, though present in his cabinet, controlled most of the countryside through ELAS, their massive army. Each side suspected the other of preparing to seize power when the moment came. The question of disarmament became the breaking point. Papandreou, under British pressure, demanded that all partisan forces lay down their arms and merge into a national army. On paper, it sounded fair, one army, one government. But in reality, the communists knew what it meant: surrender their only leverage. Without ELAS, they would be defenseless in the face of monarchists, collaborators turned loyalists, and right-wing militias now gathering strength. ELAS refused. Their leaders insisted they would not dissolve their army until the monarchy's future was settled. They pointed to the king's unpopularity and accused the government of plotting to restore him against the people's will. Papandreou countered that without disarmament, there could be no stability. The talks grew tense, every meeting ending in stalemate. The British presence in Athens only deepened the rift. Tanks rolled through Syntagma Square. Soldiers patrolled the streets. At first, many Athenians welcomed them as liberators, but as weeks passed, the sight of British bayonets began to feel like a foreign occupation. Strikes and protests broke out, demanding bread, jobs, and justice for collaborators. ELAS quietly supported the unrest, strengthening its position. By December 1944, the fragile coalition collapsed. The communist ministers resigned from the government in protest of Papandreou's disarmament plan. Their departure was more than symbolic. It signaled open defiance. The very next day, tens of thousands of demonstrators flooded Athens in support of EAM, waving banners, chanting slogans, demanding change. The government, fearful of a coup, ordered the demonstration banned. Police opened fire on the crowd. Over 30 protesters were killed, many more wounded. Blood stained the streets of the liberated capital. The illusion of unity was gone. The massacre electrified Athens. To the left, it was proof that the government had betrayed the people. To the right, it confirmed that the communists were preparing for insurrection. Within hours, ELAS units in and around the city prepared for battle. The British, realizing what was about to unfold, rushed reinforcements into the capital. Liberation had lasted barely 2 months before Athens was once again a battlefield. Not against Germans this time, but against fellow Greeks. The civil war, long brewing in the mountains and exile halls, had finally erupted in the heart of the capital. Athens, December 3rd, 1944. The city that had only weeks earlier cheered its liberation now trembled with gunfire. That morning, tens of thousands of demonstrators gathered in Syntagma Square. They carried flags, portraits of resistance fighters, and banners demanding bread, justice, and freedom from foreign meddling. Many were unarmed civilians, students, workers, women with children. Their chant was simple: Greece belongs to the people. The government had already declared the demonstration illegal. Tension crackled as the crowd swelled. Some British officers looked on nervously, aware that a single shot could turn celebration into chaos. And then, it came. Police fired directly into the mass of protesters. Panic erupted. People scattered. Screams filled the square, and bodies lay sprawled on the cobblestones. Over 30 were killed, dozens more wounded. The December massacre, as it came to be remembered, was no accident of confusion. To the left, it was a calculated attempt by Papandreou's government and its British backers to silence the people. To the right, it was a tragic but necessary act to prevent a communist coup. In truth, it was the spark that lit the inferno. Within hours, Athens was transformed. ELAS units in and around the city mobilized. Barricades rose in working-class neighborhoods. Armed men patrolled the streets, preparing for open confrontation. Across the city, civilians, terrified, furious, divided, chose sides. Some gave shelter to ELAS fighters. Others whispered warnings to the police. The British scrambled to respond. Tanks rolled into the city center, paratroopers secured key government buildings, and artillery units were positioned on the hills. Prime Minister Churchill, following events from London, insisted that Athens must not fall to communism. Orders went out. The British were not to stand aside. They were to fight. The irony was bitter. ELAS fighters had fought side by side with the Allies against the Germans. Now, in the streets of liberated Athens, they faced Allied bayonets. To many partisans, it felt like betrayal. Songs once sung in celebration of Churchill were now twisted into curses. The first clashes erupted that same night. ELAS snipers fired on government troops from rooftops. Police stations were stormed. British patrols came under fire in narrow alleys. The line between civilian and soldier blurred as neighborhoods became battlegrounds. For ordinary Athenians, life collapsed into fear. Families huddled in basements as shells crashed outside. Food, already scarce, became unobtainable. Water and electricity failed in many districts. Parents whispered lullabies to children as the city thundered with the sound of artillery. Artillery fired not by occupiers, but by supposed liberators. The massacre hardened positions on both sides. The communists declared Papandreou's government illegitimate. The government branded ELAS as rebels and terrorists. The British framed the conflict as a struggle to prevent Greece from falling behind the Iron Curtain, even before the Cold War had fully begun. The city was trapped in a nightmare. Liberation had promised hope, but December delivered only betrayal and blood. The battle for Athens was underway, and neither side intended to back down. The massacre of December 3rd was not the end. It was the beginning. Within hours, Athens erupted into open warfare. The Dekemvriana, the December events, had begun. For the next 6 weeks, the city of philosophers and poets would be consumed by fire and fury. ELAS, determined to seize the initiative, struck first. Fighters armed with rifles, Molotov cocktails, and machine guns seized police stations and government offices. In working-class districts like Kaisariani and Nea Smyrni, they dug trenches, built barricades, and prepared for siege. To many residents, ELAS were still heroes, defenders of the people against police who had fired into crowds. Women carried ammunition in baskets disguised as loaves of bread. Children served as messengers darting through alleys under fire. The British and the Greek government hit back with overwhelming force. Tanks rumbled down narrow boulevards, crushing barricades. Spitfire aircraft roared overhead, strafing ELAS positions. Artillery rained shells onto neighborhoods that had once sung songs of liberation. The city that had survived famine under the Germans now trembled under the guns of its supposed liberators. The fighting was brutal and intimate. Rooftop snipers pinned down patrols. House-to-house combat left walls riddled with bullet holes. Civilians, caught between sides, were sometimes shot on suspicion of helping the enemy. Families fled their homes, clutching blankets and icons as flames consumed entire blocks. The line between soldier and civilian blurred. Athens had become a battlefield where every street corner was a front line. ELAS fought ferociously, but they faced a grim disadvantage. They were skilled in guerrilla warfare in mountains and forests. But Athens was different. Here, British tanks could dominate open streets. British artillery silenced strongholds. And most of all, British control of the sea and air meant ELAS could not match the steady flow of reinforcements and supplies. Still, there were moments when it seemed ELAS might prevail. They captured swaths of the city, surrounding government buildings. For a time, Papandreou's government huddled under British protection, its survival hanging by a thread. In those tense days, Churchill himself feared Athens might fall to the communists. But divisions weakened ELAS. Not all leftists supported open war with Britain. Some socialist factions balked, refusing to fight the Allies they had stood beside against Hitler. This hesitation sapped momentum. For every neighborhood that rallied to ELAS, another hesitated, fearful of bloodshed or retribution. The suffering of civilians grew unbearable. Breadlines vanished. Corpses lay uncollected in the streets. The Red Cross struggled to provide aid, but often could not reach besieged areas. Athens, the cradle of democracy, had become a city of hunger, fire, and silence, broken only by gunfire. By late December, the tide was turning. British reinforcements secured key districts. EAM-ELAS fighters, worn down and undersupplied, began to retreat. The guerrillas who had fought so effectively in the mountains found themselves overpowered in the capital's stone and steel. The city lay shattered. What began as a protest for unity had become a civil war within the walls of Athens. Liberation had lasted only weeks before Greece descended once more into bloodshed, and the worst was yet to come. As December 1944 bled into Christmas, the battle for Athens reached its peak. The city was a patchwork of zones, some flying government flags under British protection, others held by EAM-ELAS fighters, and vast areas reduced to rubble where neither side held clear control. To many, Greece looked on the brink of slipping entirely into communist hands. For Winston Churchill, this was unacceptable. Churchill had long staked Britain's future on Greece. He saw it not as a small Mediterranean nation, but as a cornerstone of empire and a barrier against Soviet influence. To him, losing Greece meant losing the Eastern Mediterranean, perhaps even losing the Middle East. That was a risk Britain could not take. So on Christmas Eve 1944, Churchill himself flew to Athens. It was an extraordinary move. No other Allied leader placed himself so directly into the middle of a civil war. His arrival was meant to show resolve. Britain would not abandon Greece no matter the cost. He found a capital in ruins. Streets still echoed with gunfire. Smoke hung over neighborhoods scarred by shelling. The government of Georgios Papandreou barely functioned, surviving under British protection. Civilians whispered in despair, unsure whether they were living in a liberated city or a new occupation. Churchill's goal was simple but daunting: force a political settlement before the fighting consumed everything. He convened a conference at the Hotel Grand Bretagne, gathering government ministers, church leaders, and representatives of the resistance. Even EAM-ELAS sent delegates, though their fighters continued to skirmish only streets away. The meeting was tense. EAM-ELAS demanded a large share of power, control over ministries like justice and the interior, and punishment for collaborators. Government ministers rejected these demands outright. The Archbishop of Athens, Damaskinos, attempted to mediate, urging unity and compromise, but suspicion filled every corner of the room. Churchill, never one to mince words, made his position clear. Britain would not allow Greece to become communist. If necessary, British troops would crush EAM-ELAS by force. To underline his point, he ordered British units in Athens to hold their ground, no matter the casualties. "We must not hesitate," he declared, "to fire at any armed male in Athens who assails authority." For the communists, this was proof that Britain had no intention of treating them as partners. For the right, it was a promise of salvation. For ordinary Greeks, it was confirmation that their country's future was no longer theirs to decide. It was being dictated by outsiders. The Christmas talks broke down quickly. No agreement was reached, and fighting continued through the holiday. Families huddled in basements as church bells rang hollow above the thunder of artillery. Children clutched icons while British tanks rolled past. The irony was painful. In the land of Christianity's earliest roots, Christmas was marked not by peace, but by bloodshed. In the days that followed, Churchill forced one compromise. King George II, still deeply unpopular, would not immediately return. Instead, Archbishop Damaskinos was appointed regent, a temporary measure meant to cool tensions. Papandreou, increasingly discredited, resigned. A new government formed under General Nikolaos Plastiras, a man Churchill trusted to be both strong and firmly anti-communist. On the battlefield, British superiority began to tell. Reinforcements secured the capital, cutting off EAM-ELAS positions. By early January, the communist fighters realized they could not hold Athens. Slowly, they withdrew from the city, retreating back to the mountains. The Dekemvriana was over. Athens lay in ruins, thousands dead, tens of thousands homeless. The British had secured their prize. Greece would not fall, at least not yet. But the cost was enormous. To many Greeks, Britain was no longer a liberator, but an occupier willing to shed Greek blood for imperial interests. The seeds of future war had been planted deeper than ever. By January 1945, the guns in Athens had fallen silent. EAM-ELAS fighters melted back into the mountains, leaving behind barricades, empty cartridges, and shattered buildings. The British had held the capital, the monarchy's allies remained in charge, and the communists were forced into retreat. But the price of the Dekemvriana was staggering, and its consequences would haunt Greece for years to come. The city bore scars that would not heal quickly. Thousands lay dead, many of them civilians caught in the crossfire. Entire districts, once buzzing with the joy of liberation, now stood gutted by shell fire. Churches, schools, and homes were reduced to rubble. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, and the morgues with the unclaimed dead. In some neighborhoods, families buried their loved ones in courtyards because the cemeteries were too dangerous to reach during the fighting. For the survivors, Athens was no longer a city of celebration, but one of suspicion. Neighbors whispered about who had supported ELAS, who had sided with the government, who had collaborated with the British. Families were divided, sometimes literally, with brothers fighting on opposite sides of the barricades. The idea of national unity, so loudly proclaimed in the early days of liberation, seemed like a cruel joke. Politically, the outcome was equally bitter. Prime Minister Georgios Papandreou resigned under pressure, his credibility shattered. In his place, General Nikolaos Plastiras, a committed anti-communist, assumed power. Archbishop Damaskinos was installed as regent, a compromise meant to hold the monarchy question in check. But no one was fooled. Britain still pulled the strings. The communists, though defeated in Athens, were not destroyed. They remained the largest single political force in the countryside, still armed and still organized. Their retreat was not surrender, but a recalibration. Leaders of EAM-ELAS insisted they had been betrayed, that they had bled for liberation only to be stabbed in the back by their allies. In villages across Greece, that narrative resonated deeply. The British, meanwhile, declared victory. To Churchill, Athens had been saved from communism. In Parliament, he defended the intervention, arguing that the alternative would have been Soviet domination of the Aegean. Many in Britain, weary of war, were unconvinced. They asked why British soldiers were dying in the streets of Athens when the Germans had already gone. Churchill, ever defiant, insisted it was a necessary sacrifice. On the ground in Greece, however, the perception was darker. To many Greeks, the British looked less like liberators and more like occupiers. Their tanks in Syntagma Square, their artillery shells in Kaisariani, their willingness to fire on former allies, all of it left a bitter taste. The bond forged during the resistance against Hitler had been broken. In February 1945, an attempt was made to put the conflict to rest. The Varkiza Agreement was signed, requiring ELAS to disarm in exchange for promises of political amnesty and free elections. On paper, it was peace. In reality, it was the beginning of a new cycle of violence. Thousands of leftists were arrested, tortured, or executed despite the supposed amnesty. Former collaborators re-emerged in uniform, now repurposed as anti-communist militias. The wounds of December had poisoned the nation. The government held Athens, but not the loyalty of its people. The communists lost the capital, but gained martyrs. And Britain had secured its geopolitical prize, at the cost of sowing seeds of hatred that would soon bloom into open war once again. The Dekemvriana was not the end of Greece's troubles. It was the prologue to something far worse. The smoke from Athens had barely cleared when Greece's leaders gathered in a quiet seaside suburb to negotiate peace. The guns of the Dekemvriana had silenced ELAS in the capital, but everyone knew the communists were far from defeated. The question was how to end the bloodshed without igniting an even greater war. The answer, or what seemed like one, was the Varkiza Agreement. On February 12, 1945, delegates from the government, the communist-led EM, and the British met at the villa of a wealthy shipowner in Varkiza, outside Athens. The setting was idyllic. Waves lapped gently on the shore, and the winter sun cast a pale light over the hills. Inside, the mood was tense. The communists came to the table knowing their position was weakened. They had lost Athens, and their fighters were exhausted, but they also knew they remained strong in the countryside, where ELAS still commanded loyalty. Their negotiators demanded amnesty for their partisans, democratic elections, and a say in the new government. Without those guarantees, they warned, disarmament would be suicide. The government, now led by General Nikolaos Plastiras and overseen by Regent Archbishop Damaskinos, was less interested in compromise. Backed firmly by the British, they wanted one thing above all, the dissolution of ELAS as a military force. Only then, they argued, could Greece return to normalcy. The British acted as referees, but everyone knew where they stood. Churchill had made his position clear. ELAS was not to be trusted. Disarmament was non-negotiable. Britain would guarantee elections, but only under a government aligned with the West. After days of tense talks, an agreement was reached. ELAS would lay down its arms. In return, the government promised political amnesty for fighters, a referendum on the monarchy, and free elections within the year. On paper, it looked like a fair compromise. But cracks appeared immediately. The amnesty applied only to political crimes, not to acts of violence that could be classified as ordinary. This vague wording gave the government wide latitude. Executions of collaborators, for instance, could be rebranded as murder. Confiscations of property could be treated as theft. Suddenly, thousands of ELAS veterans found themselves vulnerable to prosecution. Meanwhile, the process of disarmament was swift and highly public. In villages across Greece, partisans stacked rifles, machine guns, and mortars in great piles, handing them over to British officers. For many fighters, it was an act of humiliation. These were the weapons with which they had defeated Italians and Germans, the tools of their pride. Now they were surrendering them not to enemies, but to supposed allies who distrusted them. Some fighters cried as they marched home, unarmed. Others quietly buried weapons in fields and forests, unwilling to believe peace would last. At first, there was relief. The fighting in Athens had ended, and the promise of elections gave hope. But beneath the surface, bitterness festered. Right-wing militias, many formed from former collaborators, began targeting suspected communists. The government, instead of restraining them, often looked the other way. The amnesty of Varkiza became meaningless as thousands of leftists were arrested, beaten, or exiled. For the communists, the lesson was clear. They had been tricked. They had disarmed in good faith, but their enemies had not disarmed their hatred. The promises of democracy and reconciliation looked increasingly like a trap. The Varkiza Agreement was meant to close the chapter of civil war. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new and darker phase. The guns had been laid down, but the war was far from over. The ink on the Varkiza Agreement had barely dried before its promises began to unravel. On paper, Greece was at peace. ELAS had disarmed, amnesty was guaranteed, and elections were promised. In reality, the disarmament left thousands of former partisans defenseless, while their enemies grew bolder than ever. The months that followed became known as the White Terror, a wave of right-wing reprisals that scarred Greece even deeper. The process began quietly. Villages that had once supported the resistance saw unfamiliar men in uniform return, many of them former members of the German-backed security battalions. Rebranded as patriots, they now wore the badges of the new state, carrying rifles with British approval. Their mission, unofficial but clear, was simple: crush the left. Arrests came first. Former ELAS fighters, despite the supposed amnesty, were rounded up on flimsy charges. Courts ruled that executions of collaborators during the occupation counted as common crimes, stripping fighters of protection. Thousands were imprisoned, often in squalid camps or on barren exile islands. Some were tortured. Others disappeared altogether. Then came the militias. Across the countryside, vigilante groups formed, sometimes sanctioned by local officials, sometimes operating in the shadows. They raided villages, burned homes, and targeted families accused of communist sympathies. Men were dragged from beds in the night and executed. Women were humiliated, beaten, or worse. Children grew up with the sound of boots at their doors. For survivors of the Axis occupation, the irony was unbearable. Men who had fought the Nazis were now treated as criminals, while those who had collaborated strutted in new uniforms, emboldened by government backing. Old grudges resurfaced as neighbors denounced one another for personal gain. A vendetta settled under the cover of anti-communism was as common as true political persecution. The British presence did little to help. To many Greeks, it seemed the occupiers had simply changed uniforms. British officers advised the Greek police and army but turned a blind eye to abuses by militias. Their priority was clear: keep Greece from sliding into communism, whatever the cost. Civil liberties were expendable. For ordinary people, the terror was suffocating. In mountain villages, peasants whispered about hidden rifles buried after Varkiza, wondering if they should dig them up. In cities, leftist newspapers were shut down, strikes broken with violence. Families of resistance fighters lived in constant fear. Some sent their children abroad, others fled north to Yugoslavia and Albania, carrying tales of betrayal. The repression bred resistance. Small bands of former ELAS fighters regrouped in the mountains, launching sporadic attacks on police posts and militias. They were poorly armed, disorganized, and scattered, but their very existence kept the dream of renewed struggle alive. For many leftists, it became clear that peace was an illusion. The White Terror was not reconciliation, it was preparation for the next war. By the end of 1945, thousands were dead or imprisoned. Greece, barely free from the Axis, was once again a nation ruled by fear. The wounds of occupation had not healed, they had been replaced by new wounds, inflicted by Greeks upon Greeks. The White Terror was meant to ensure stability. Instead, it planted the seeds of the third round of the Civil War. In villages and valleys across the country, the whispers grew louder. The time would come to fight again. By 1946, the uneasy peace promised at Varkiza was broken beyond repair. The White Terror had left villages scarred, prisons overcrowded, and thousands of former resistance fighters humiliated or exiled. Greece had been liberated from German occupation only to stumble into a darker struggle. For the communists, the conclusion was clear. They had laid down their arms once and paid dearly. They would not make the same mistake again. The spark came in the small village of Litokoro at the foot of Mount Olympus. On March 30th, 1946, a band of armed men, many ex-ELAS fighters, stormed the police station. Shots rang out, officers fell, weapons were seized, and by dawn the attackers had melted back into the mountains. The raid was small, but it carried enormous weight. It was the symbolic beginning of the third round of the Greek Civil War. Those fighters called themselves the Democratic Army of Greece, DSE. In the early months, they were a patchwork of guerrilla bands, poorly supplied, scattered across rugged terrain, often relying on hidden caches of weapons buried after Varkiza. Yet their determination was ironclad. They were not fighting for survival alone. They believed they were the vanguard of a new Greece, one built on social justice, land reform, and liberation from foreign meddling. The government in Athens responded with fury. It denounced the Litokoro raid as treason and escalated the crackdown. More arrests, more executions, more collective punishments followed, but repression only swelled the ranks of the guerrillas. For every man dragged off by police, another joined the fighters in the hills. For every village raided by militias, another opened its doors to the DSE. International winds soon swept into Greece. The Second World War was over, but a new global conflict, the Cold War, was beginning. To Britain, Greece was a vital domino. To Moscow, it was tempting but distant. Stalin, bound by his 1944 percentages agreement with Churchill, held back. But Greece's neighbors, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria, did not. They saw an opportunity to support fellow revolutionaries. Supplies, weapons, and safe havens flowed across the northern borders. Of these, Tito's Yugoslavia became the lifeline, turning the DSE from a scattered rebellion into a true guerrilla army. The guerrillas were masters of terrain. They ambushed convoys, mined roads, and launched daring raids on garrisons. Women fought alongside men, carrying rifles on mountain trails. In villages under their control, they organized people's committees, held rallies, and promised land for the poor. Their propaganda drew on memories of the resistance against the Nazis, framing the struggle as a continuation of liberation. But Greece was not united behind them. Many still remembered the harsh purges and hostage-taking of ELAS during the occupation and the Dekemvriana. For every village that offered bread and shelter, another feared their arrival. The country was split not just geographically, but within families, brothers taking opposite sides, parents torn between loyalty to their children and fear of reprisal. Meanwhile, Britain strained to hold its grip. The empire was exhausted, its coffers nearly empty after 6 years of war. By 1947, London admitted it could no longer finance or sustain Greece. The burden passed to a new power, the United States. But even before the Truman Doctrine was announced, British soldiers continued to fight, training the Greek army, patrolling cities, and directing offensives against the growing insurgency. By the end of 1946, the Civil War was undeniable. Skirmishes multiplied into battles. Towns in northern Greece briefly flew the red flag before being retaken by government forces. The hills and forests echoed with gunfire once more. The war that Greeks had hoped ended with liberation had only entered its bloodiest chapter. The third round had begun, and Greece was no longer fighting alone. It was now a front line of the Cold War. The guerrillas of the Democratic Army of Greece, DSE, never forgot the humiliation of December 1944. Though their strength lay in the mountains, the memory of losing Athens still burned. By the late 1940s, the capital itself once again became the symbol of everything at stake: power, legitimacy, and the future of the Greek state. While the largest battles of the Civil War raged in the north, Athens remained the prize everyone measured themselves against. By 1947, the DSE was no longer a handful of bands hiding in forests. With Yugoslav and Albanian support, it had become a disciplined force numbering tens of thousands. They carried captured German rifles, mortars, even artillery. Training camps across the border supplied new recruits, and seasoned ELAS veterans provided leadership. From the mountains of Macedonia and Epirus, they launched coordinated offensives, striking towns, ambushing convoys, and then vanishing into the highlands. But Athens was different. Heavily fortified, guarded by the National Army and British advisors, it was not a city to be stormed lightly. The DSE knew this. Instead of a direct assault, they waged a campaign of infiltration and sabotage. Cells of communist sympathizers remained in the capital, organizing strikes, spreading propaganda, and gathering intelligence. At night, bombs exploded under police cars. Posters declaring "Greece for the people" appeared on walls, only to be torn down by government forces hours later. The government, meanwhile, had turned Athens into a garrison. Barricades and checkpoints dotted the city. The army patrolled the streets, often side by side with British troops. Right-wing militias stalked neighborhoods suspected of harboring sympathizers. Arrests were constant. Students, trade unionists, former ELAS fighters dragged from homes and interrogated in police basements. Fear was everywhere, and yet so was defiance. Ordinary Athenians bore the heaviest weight. Shops closed early, bread remained scarce, and families lived under the constant shadow of raids. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Was the man across the street a government loyalist or a courier for the DSE? Silence became a survival tactic. Children grew up with the sound of boots on cobblestones and the distant thud of explosions. By 1948, the struggle reached a new intensity. With American aid now flowing through the Truman Doctrine, the Greek army in Athens was better armed, better trained, and more confident. U.S. advisors pushed for aggressive counterinsurgency measures, search and destroy operations in the capital, mass arrests of suspected communists, and propaganda campaigns framing the DSE as foreign puppets. Billboards appeared declaring, "Greece or the Soviets, choose." The communists countered with their own vision. In pamphlets smuggled into the city, they promised land redistribution, workers' rights, and independence from foreign control. To many in Athens' working-class districts, it was a powerful message. But to the middle classes, weary of war and chaos, it sounded like the path to endless bloodshed. Although no full-scale battle engulfed Athens as it had in 1944, the capital remained the symbolic heart of the war. Each clash in the mountains, each victory or defeat, echoed in its streets. Every funeral for a fallen soldier, every protest broken by police, reminded Athenians that the war was not some distant conflict, it was their daily reality. In the end, Athens would not fall to the DSE. Its walls of soldiers, tanks, and foreign backing proved too formidable, but its role as the ever-present battleground of memory and propaganda gave the Civil War its sharpest edge. Whoever could claim Athens, if not physically, then politically, would claim Greece. The city that had been liberated from Nazis, torn apart by the Dekemvriana, and militarized by allies now stood as the most contested symbol in Europe's first Cold War battlefield. By 1947, Britain was finished. Exhausted by 6 years of global war, broke from maintaining its empire, and bleeding resources in Greece, London admitted what had become obvious. It could no longer hold the line. But for the West, losing Greece to communism was unthinkable. That spring, a new power stepped in to take Britain's place. The fate of Greece, and perhaps the future of Europe, shifted across the Atlantic. On March 12, 1947, U.S. President Harry S. Truman stood before Congress and declared a new policy. America would support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. It was the birth of the Truman Doctrine, and Greece was its test case. To Truman and his advisors, Greece was more than a small nation in turmoil. It was the gateway to the Eastern Mediterranean. If Greece fell, so too might Turkey, and then the Middle East. The domino effect haunted every strategic calculation. Stalin's armies already occupied Eastern Europe. Washington feared that Greece could be the next piece of the puzzle. American aid began flowing almost immediately. Money, weapons, trucks, radios, and artillery poured into Greece. U.S. advisors arrived to reorganize the Greek army, training it in modern tactics and logistics. The government in Athens, long propped up by Britain, now found itself under American tutelage. The difference was stark. Where British officers had relied on limited resources, the Americans brought scale. By late 1947, the Greek army was being equipped with U.S.-supplied rifles, machine guns, and aircraft. Villages saw American jeeps rolling through their streets. For some Greeks, it was salvation. For others, it was proof that their country was no longer sovereign, but a pawn in someone else's war. Meanwhile, the Democratic Army of Greece, DSE, tried to adapt. With Yugoslav and Albanian support, they grew more sophisticated, forming larger units capable of set-piece battles instead of only guerrilla raids. In some mountain regions, they briefly established liberated zones, flying red flags and holding rallies. Women fought in the ranks, a striking image of the social revolution they promised. But American involvement raised the stakes. The Greek army, emboldened by U.S. support, launched sweeping offensives against DSE strongholds. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were emptied, their residents herded into strategic hamlets to cut off support. Planes bombed mountain trails, while artillery pounded forests and caves. Napalm, terrifying and new, was introduced to flush fighters from their hiding places. The propaganda war intensified. American advisors urged the government to frame the conflict as a battle between democracy and totalitarianism. Posters plastered walls in Athens. Choose Greece or choose Moscow. The communists countered with their own leaflets, portraying themselves as heirs of the anti-Nazi resistance, fighting once again for the people. Caught in the middle, civilians paid the price. Families were uprooted, children sent abroad by both sides, some evacuated by the communists to Eastern Bloc countries, others seized by the government for re-education. Farms were abandoned, villages destroyed, and hunger spread once again across the countryside. For ordinary Greeks, the arrival of American aid did not mean peace. It meant the war would only intensify. The Truman Doctrine saved Greece from collapse, but it also ensured that the Civil War would escalate into a full-scale showdown. The country was no longer fighting its own battle. It was fighting the first hot war of the Cold War. The communists of the Democratic Army of Greece, DSE, had long relied on a lifeline from across Greece's northern borders. Yugoslavia, under Josip Broz Tito, provided weapons, training camps, and safe havens. Albania opened its rugged mountains as supply routes, and Bulgaria contributed logistical support. Together, they gave the DSE the breathing space it needed to challenge the government in Athens. But by 1948, international politics dealt the guerrillas a devastating blow: the Tito-Stalin split. The roots of the crisis lay in the post-war communist world. Stalin demanded discipline and obedience from all satellite movements. Tito, however, envisioned a more independent path for Yugoslavia. He defied Moscow's orders, seeking influence across the Balkans and supporting revolutions where Stalin preferred caution. Greece became a flashpoint. Tito saw in the DSE not just comrades, but a tool to expand Yugoslavia's influence. He supplied them with everything from rifles and machine guns to artillery and medical aid. Greek fighters crossed the border freely, finding sanctuary in Yugoslav villages and camps. Without Tito, the DSE would have struggled to survive beyond 1946, but Stalin was wary. The percentages agreement he had struck with Churchill in 1944 had effectively conceded Greece to the Western sphere. Direct Soviet support risked confrontation with the United States, a fight he was not ready for. To Stalin, Tito's open backing of the Greek communists was reckless, a challenge to his authority. The conflict came to a head in 1948, when Stalin expelled Yugoslavia from the Cominform. Overnight, the Greek communists lost their most important sponsor. Tito, isolated from the Soviet bloc, shut his border with Greece. DSE fighters who had relied on Yugoslav supply lines suddenly found themselves cut off, stranded in the mountains without food, ammunition, or medical care. The effect was immediate and crippling. Guerrilla units that once launched daring offensives now struggled to feed themselves. Ammunition was rationed carefully. Fighters often went into battle with only a handful of bullets. Wounded men and women, once treated in Yugoslav hospitals, died in caves for lack of bandages or medicine. The dream of sustaining a people's army shrank with every passing month. Inside Greece, morale faltered. The DSE had promised its fighters that international socialism would not abandon them. Yet Stalin's hands-off approach and Tito's betrayal left them isolated. Some questioned whether they had been pawns in a wider game. Others clung desperately to hope, convinced that Moscow would intervene before it was too late. But the intervention never came. Meanwhile, the government forces grew stronger. With American aid pouring in under the Truman Doctrine, the National Army expanded, modernized, and gained confidence. U.S. advisors pressed for more aggressive tactics, encirclements, scorched earth campaigns, and the use of napalm to clear forests. Against this juggernaut, the DSE, deprived of its supply routes, began to wither. For civilians in northern Greece, the split deepened their suffering. Villages that had once depended on cross-border trade found themselves isolated. Refugees who had fled to Yugoslavia or Albania were now trapped in limbo. Families were divided, some children taken east by communist evacuation campaigns, others seized by government programs for re-education. The Tito-Stalin split was more than a quarrel between two leaders. It was the moment the Greek Civil War's balance tipped decisively. The DSE had once dared to imagine victory. By late 1948, survival itself became uncertain. The communists had always proclaimed themselves the heirs of Greece's resistance against the Nazis, the champions of the poor and the oppressed. But geopolitics cared little for ideals. In the clash between Stalin and Tito, they were reduced to expendable pieces. And in Greece's mountains, those pieces were running out of time. By 1949, the Greek Civil War had entered its decisive phase. The Democratic Army of Greece, DSE, once bold enough to dream of victory, now fought a desperate struggle for survival. Cut off from Yugoslavia after the Tito-Stalin split, their supply lines dwindled to a trickle through Albania. Meanwhile, the government army, backed by the full weight of American aid, prepared to deliver a crushing blow. The Greek National Army had been transformed. U.S. advisors reorganized its command structure, supplied it with modern weapons, and drilled it in counterinsurgency. Villages suspected of aiding the guerrillas were emptied, their residents relocated into fortified strategic hamlets. New radio systems gave commanders real-time communication, while American planes prowled the skies overhead. Most terrifying of all was napalm, dropped on forests and mountain hideouts, turning cover into infernos. Against this, the DSE clung to the highlands. Their strongholds were in the Grammos and Vitsi mountain ranges near the Albanian border, remote, rugged terrain they knew intimately. Fighters dug bunkers into the slopes, strung barbed wire, and stockpiled what little ammunition they had. Women carried rifles alongside men. Teenagers joined the ranks to replace fallen veterans. Songs around campfires spoke of sacrifice and hope. But everyone knew the balance of power had shifted. In the summer of 1949, the government launched its final offensive. Over 100,000 soldiers, supported by artillery, tanks, and American aircraft, advanced on Grammos. The guerrillas, numbering fewer than 20,000, resisted fiercely. For weeks, the mountains echoed with gunfire and explosions. Villages below watched the night sky glow red from artillery barrages. Guerrillas fought to the last bullet, sometimes charging with bayonets when ammunition ran dry. The US-trained army pressed relentlessly, cutting off escape routes and tightening its encirclement. Planes dropped bombs that set forests ablaze, smoke choking the fighters in their trenches. Napalm, used in horrifying quantities, clung to skin and earth alike, consuming everything it touched. Survivors would later recall the smell of burning pine mixing with screams on the wind. By late August, Grammos was collapsing. The DSE staged desperate counterattacks, but their lines buckled under the sheer weight of firepower. Thousands were killed. Thousands more streamed north across the Albanian border, wounded and starving. The once proud army of resistance was now a battered remnant. The final blow came at Mount Vitsi, where the remnants of the DSE made their last stand. Again, they were surrounded, bombarded, and burned out of their positions. By early September, organized communist resistance in Greece had effectively ended. For the government in Athens, it was a triumphant victory. Soldiers paraded through cities, waving flags, while church bells rang in celebration. For Washington, it was proof that the Truman Doctrine worked, that communism could be stopped through aid and force of arms. But for the guerrillas, and for the many civilians who had suffered alongside them, it was a tragedy. Families fled into exile in Albania, Yugoslavia, and across Eastern Europe. Some never returned. Villages that had sheltered fighters were punished with executions and mass arrests. Greece was free of war, but it was also a nation deeply scarred, its wounds far from healed. The Civil War was over, but its legacy of division, betrayal, and foreign intervention would haunt Greece for generations. The guns fell silent in September 1949, but Greece was far from healed. The Civil War had left the country in ruins, physically, politically, and emotionally. It was the first true battlefield of the Cold War, and its scars would shape Greek society for decades. The cost was staggering. More than 150,000 Greeks were killed, with countless more maimed, imprisoned, or exiled. Entire villages had been emptied. Farms lay abandoned, their fields overgrown with weeds. Bridges, roads, and railways destroyed during the occupation, and the Civil War remained in ruins. The economy, already fragile after years of Axis exploitation, was shattered. Hunger returned to many regions. For ordinary Greeks, peace meant little more than survival. Families bore the deepest wounds. Brothers had fought on opposite sides, sometimes killing each other in battle. Parents mourned children lost to executions, to exile, or to indoctrination programs. Tens of thousands of children had been spirited away, some evacuated by the communists to Eastern Bloc countries, others seized by the government for patriotic education. Many never saw their families again. The war had not just divided a nation, it had torn apart households. Politically, the victory of the government cemented Greece firmly in the Western camp. The monarchy was restored, though weakened, and right-wing governments dominated for years. Communists were banned, their leaders imprisoned or executed, their supporters surveilled and harassed. The other Greece, as the left came to be called, lived under suspicion and repression, branded as traitors despite their role in resisting the Axis. For the West, Greece was a success story, a test case of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Billions in aid rebuilt infrastructure, modernized the army, and stabilized the currency. Athens became a symbol of containment, proof that communism could be stopped at Europe's edge. For Washington and London, Greece was not just a victory, it was a message to Moscow. Yet beneath the surface, the wounds festered. The memory of the White Terror, the brutality of the Dekemvriana, the betrayals of the Varkiza Agreement, all of it lingered in popular memory. Even as the economy slowly improved, the political divide remained toxic. Every election, every strike, every protest carried echoes of the war, and the seeds of authoritarianism planted during those years bore bitter fruit. In 1967, a group of right-wing officers seized power, establishing the Colonel's Junta, a dictatorship that ruled Greece for 7 years. Their regime, repressive and nationalistic, drew legitimacy in part from the narrative of the Civil War, that Greece had once nearly fallen to communism and that vigilance justified authoritarian rule. For the left, exile became a way of life. Communities of Greek refugees lived for decades in Eastern Europe, their children growing up speaking Slavic languages alongside Greek. Some returned after amnesty laws in the 1980s. Others never did. The diaspora carried with it stories of betrayal, of foreign meddling, of dreams of a different Greece that never came to be. Today, historians view the Greek Civil War as more than a domestic tragedy. It was the first hot conflict of the Cold War, a crucible where the United States and the Soviet Union tested their wills, even if Stalin himself kept his distance. It set patterns that would echo in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Foreign aid propping up one side, proxy forces fighting for ideology, and civilians paying the highest price. But at its heart, it was also a Greek story, of neighbors turned enemies, of ideals clashing with survival, of a cradle of democracy torn apart by modern geopolitics. Liberation from the Nazis had promised freedom. Instead, it had opened the door to another war. And so, as the dust settled, the haunting question remained: how does a nation, victorious against one of history's greatest evils, descend into fighting itself? Greece's civil war offered no easy answer, only the bitter truth that liberation can be the beginning of another kind of captivity.